All right, we're going to do factor by grouping here, and we're going to need this in order to factor quadratics. So our first example here is factor 3n to the third minus 12n squared plus 2n minus 8. And we're going to go ahead and start by grouping these. So you group two things together, and then you group the last two things together. So we want to think of the GCF here. So what's the GCF of 3n cubed minus 12n squared? So the 3 and the 12, the GCF of it is a 3, so you could factor out the 3, and then the n third and the n squared, the GCF would be a n squared. So you're going to go ahead and factor that out, which means divide. So 3 divided by 3, that's just 1, and then the n cubed, if you took out 2 of them, you're left with 1. Okay, then the next letter, or the next number, negative 12 divided by 3, that's going to be negative 4, and then you took out both of those n's, so you could close the parentheses there. Then for the next two, the GCF would be a 2 because you could divide 2 and 8 by 2, and then as far as the variables, they have no GCF. So you don't have to take any variables out. So you're left with an n here for the first one, and then negative 8 divided by 2, that's negative 4. All right, and if you did the factor by grouping correctly, then in the parentheses, you should have the exact same thing. So I know I did it correctly, and I could move on to the next step. So my next step is basically now you have one big term here, and what do they have in common? Well, they have in common the n minus 2, or n minus 4. So we're going to go ahead and factor that out. N minus 4. So what are you left with here? If you factor out the n minus 4, you're left with the 3n squared. And then what are you left with here? If you factor out the n minus 4, you're left with a plus 2. So there we go. We went ahead and factored that. All right, moving on to example number 2. We're going to go ahead and factor 15q to the third plus 40q squared plus 3q plus 8. All right, so again, we're going to go ahead and group the first two things and the last two things together. And then we're going to think of the GCF. So 15 and 40, I know the GCF is 5. And then as far as the variables, I could factor out 2 of the q, so that would be q squared. And then you do 15 divided by 5, that's 3. If you took out 2 q's, you would be left with 1. And then 40 divided by 5 is 8. And you took out both of those q's, so you're not left with anything. Okay, and then now 3q and 8. So you can't divide anything into both of them. And then they both don't have a variable, so you can't take out the variables. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a placeholder of a 1, because you could divide both of them by 1. So if you divide anything by 1, it's just itself. So now, inside the parentheses, you have the same thing, so you know you did it correctly. So next thing is we're going to go ahead and factor out that 3q plus 8. So again, here, if you factor out the 3q plus 8, you're left with a 5q squared. And then over here, if you factor out the 3q plus 8, you're left with a plus 1. Now, many students forget the 1 here. So do not forget the 1 as a placeholder.